Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center, and Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And we're so pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each of our Summer Hot Topics lectures is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit. So if you're an attorney looking to claim CLE credits for these talks, please keep track of which you attend for your own records. After the talk today, we'll have time for Q&A. And for those of you that are watching online on YouTube, you can enter your questions in the chat or comment space, and we'll get through as many as we can. Today, we're very pleased to welcome our speaker, Mavis Gragg. Mavis is a self-described death and dirt attorney and conservation professional, empowering families to use real estate as a source of intergenerational resiliency and wealth. She currently serves as the director of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention, and is the CEO of HeirShares, which is building groundbreaking technology to facilitate affordable solutions for family real estate ownership. Professor Gragg joins us this year as our Distinguished Agriculture and Food Systems Scholar, and previously she taught a summer course at VLGS called Protecting Family Land, Heirs Property. Today, her talk is titled Cultivating Connections, the Evolution of a Network for Attorneys Working with Heirs Property. Please join me in welcoming Mavis Gragg.
Thank you. So last summer, I had the opportunity to present in this Hot Topics about heirs property, and we did a pretty comprehensive overview of what heirs property is, what are some of the legal issues related to heirs property, and then how some of us who are working with heirs properties, where heirs property owners are approaching resolution of these issues. And there's been some exciting developments over the last year, including the development and evolution of the heirs property practitioner network. And today I would like to do a recap of what we discussed last year so that folks who aren't familiar with heirs property can hear about what it is. And then we'll transition to look at some of the incredible opportunities and challenges that can be addressed through innovation. And we'll talk about some pretty important milestones that have happened this year. And then I'd invite folks to share in the chat. I'm not sure if folks will have the ability to speak, but in the chat, I would like to invite folks to provide input on how this network of incredible attorneys can navigate some of these opportunities and challenges related to heirs property. My bio is a bit updated since last year. I'm no longer the director of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program. I had the opportunity to spend a year at Harvard's Graduate School of Design as a Loeb Fellow, where I was able to amplify the stories of heirs property owners and the work that a lot of attorneys in this movement are doing with folks who are in architecture, design, urban planning, landscape architecture. Pretty wonderful experience. And now I'll move full-time to HeirShares, where I am working on technology-driven solutions that support resolution and co-management of heirs property issues. And I have quite a bit of experience in the green space, if you will, including serving on North Carolina's Parks and Rec Trust Fund, and serving as board chair of a regional land trust in my home state of North Carolina. So heirs property is inherited real estate, and it's a very important means of family wealth preservation. If we think about ownership of real estate in the U.S., for many families, it is part of the American dream. You have a home, you have land, you have an ability to support yourself with housing, with income, with food, etc. And passing ownership of family land through inheritance is part of the bedrock of the legal system in terms of inheritance, that your family real estate will stay in the family by virtue of inheritance. However, the legal structure of heirs property, which I'll mention again in a minute, creates a lot of vulnerabilities that have caused a lot of families to lose real estate. And the impacts have gone beyond those families to the community where the real estate is situated, but also on a landscape scale. And there's, given the significant loss that's occurred and is occurring, there have been some pretty cool innovative initiatives to preserve heirs property. So just to give you an idea about the legal functioning of it, I want to use this family as an example. If we imagine that in 1980, Bob Smith had a house, he bought a house and then married Anna and transferred the house to himself and Anna, so they co-own the property. And then Bob dies, the property passes, Anna dies, there's another succession of ownership. And fast forward to 2023, we have numerous owners. And that's because when property is passed through inheritance, it goes to each heir. It splits up into multiple shares. So we went from 1 to 2 to 6 and so on. And the ownership model in the present time consists of a non-blood related family member, Bob's son-in-law, but also a developer, because over time, one of the family members sold their share to a developer who is interested in the Smith family property. This is a pretty common timeline of ownership history for many families in the U.S., across racial backgrounds, across ethnicities, but also very common for families who are what we call land rich, cash poor, who have been maintaining ownership through inheritance without planning. Intestate succession is a set of laws that apply with inheritance when someone does not have a will. I do want to point out that wills are not the reason, or lack of wills is not the reason why people have heirs property. In most cases, people with wills actually create heirs property, meaning that they're transferring the property to multiple people. But by and large, because most folks don't have an estate plan, we are relying on the intestate succession laws to understand how someone's real estate went to their heirs. And it really varies from state to state. I've done a legal survey of all 50 states plus DC, and it's pretty interesting to see how every state allocates real estate ownership to heirs. In my home state of North Carolina, it's even possible for a surviving spouse to inherit real estate with their in-laws. In other states, it's even messier. You know, they don't favor blended families. And so you have to have been married to the person first and not have kids with other people, et cetera. It's pretty crazy, I would say, intestate succession. And so it provides a lot of unpredictability about who the owners are. And then, as I mentioned before, we necessarily increase the number of owners as time goes on. And the reason why is because the legal bundle of rights, so to the right of the screen, if you look at the legal bundle of rights, they own the property as tenants in common. And what that means is that you don't have a specific acreage in the property, you have an undivided interest in the property. So you have a percentage of the whole. And then you also, any decisions related to the property have to be unanimous decisions amongst all the owners. And I imagine if we took everyone on this Zoom and we were family members owning this property, it would be very difficult for us to make a decision, even if it was something simple like whether or not to let someone hunt on our property or whether or not to borrow money to maintain the property. So unanimous decision making is something that makes it difficult. There's no survivorship rights amongst co-owners. And so again, that's how we get into the increased number of owners. Every owner's share goes to their heirs. And that really depends on who survives them at the time of their death. Every owner can transfer their share to whomever they want while they're alive. And that's where we get into predatory behavior. You'll have third parties who are seeking to buy real estate on the cheap by using partition actions in which they are buying an interest in heirs property. And because of the makeup of the property ownership, they are saying, hey, court, this property cannot be physically divided, so you must sell it. And historically, the sale is done at auction, which means that the property is often going for pennies on the dollar. And then, zooming out even further, or looking more in the forefront, actually, most heirs property owners, even if they're not facing the threat of a partition action, or even if they're not dealing with difficulty getting along or making decisions with their co-owners, most heirs property owners have what we call cloudy title, meaning that it's not confirmed from a legal perspective who the owners of the property are. If you recall, real estate can be passed in two ways. A deed, which is a legal record in which we have the grantor, the grantee, the legal description, it's signed and it's recorded, it becomes public record. When real estate is passing by virtue of death, there's no automatic generation of a public record for the Register of Deeds. Instead, when attorneys are hired to clear title or advise on who the ownership is, ownership of the property is, we have to rely on the family tree and then do the legal analysis using the relevant laws such as intestate succession, testate succession, what have you. And so cloudy title is one of the forefront issues that most families with heirs property have. They don't have a legally confirmed owner. And when you have that issue, you can't defend against others, your rights against others. Think about boundary disputes or people who are encroaching on your property. You can't make sound legal decisions. It's hard to build a strategic ownership strategy because you need every owner on board. It's harder to access resources to steward the property and to repair or rebuild the property, especially in cases of disaster relief. And it's also difficult to thrive, use the property as a source of income and growth of wealth, and optimize collaborative management when you don't have clear title. To give you an idea of what it looks like in terms of the prevalence of this issue, this is a map of North Carolina, my home state, and the red indicates property owned as heirs property. The shading of gray to black is indicating the proportion of African Americans or Black people who live in North Carolina. And the idea was to illustrate that oftentimes you see a lot of heirs property in communities that have been systemically brutalized in our legal system. And for many families, particularly in the African American community, availing yourself to the legal system by doing the estate administration process, by doing wills, et cetera, actually exposed them to vulnerabilities, by virtue of their information being on the public record. So the fact that we see lots of concentrations of heirs property where we see African Americans is not surprising because of the history of this community within the legal system. And then also just access to justice. And thinking in terms of what lawyers are available, particularly in rural areas, who are trustworthy and who are willing to work in a very ethical, trustworthy way, is very difficult for certain communities. And that's not just the African American community. I would say, quite frankly, people who are poor, people who are impoverished or who are land rich, cash poor are often taken advantage of within our legal services. And so we see a lot of that in North Carolina. I also want to point out in North Carolina, there's a lot of heirs property in the area of the state where I come from, which is Western North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains. And so these are a lot of land rich, cash poor white families who don't have access to legal services and who rely on intestate succession for planning their family property succession. looking at this issue at scale across the nation, the Housing Assistance Council and Fannie Mae did a study on mapping heirs property. And it is quite a complex process to map heirs property, which I'm happy to talk with folks about offline or refer you to resources to look at that. But Fannie, if you look up the Housing Assistance Council and Fannie Mae heirs property mapping report, it's a pretty comprehensive document. And these two tables or this table rather is taken from it just to illustrate how much heirs property there is across the country. And this doesn't even include all of the states. And in particular, it doesn't include New York, which has a ton of heirs property, so much so it's difficult to measure. So, you know, through the study, what we are learning is that there's an estimated $32 billion of generational family-owned real estate with cloudy title. You know, so owners who are not able to demonstrate ownership without a legal opinion, and that this creates conditions for predation, undermanagement, loss of intergenerational wealth, and more. And the risks are broader than just the families, because generational homes, generational real estate is affordable housing. Families' ability to maintain their real estate and have access to resources when there's natural disasters is climate resiliency and food security. Markets are also impacted by this issue. Kimberly Clark and the World Wildlife Federation did a study of Alabama and Mississippi, and included in that what role does heirs property play in terms of risks in those two states. And they discovered that there's so much heirs property in those two states. And families are losing the property, but families are also physically partitioning the properties into smaller parcels. It makes it much more difficult for conservation efforts when you're working with smaller parcels of land. And it makes it much more difficult to harvest timber when you're working with very small parcels. And so those two organizations actually decided that they had to play a role in this movement in order to ensure that we keep forest as forest, and that they are capable of being stewarded in the best way. A lot of attorneys have the skills and experience to work on heirs property. We're talking a mixture of inheritance laws, business laws, real estate laws, etc. However, because the issues are so complex and they take a lot of effort and resources to resolve, many attorneys will forego or charge a premium for working on heirs property matters. And quite frankly, there's no single tech-driven solution to aid the process. So there are a lot of incentives to address the legal challenges of heirs property on the individual family level. Addressing the legal issues allows them to sustain affordable housing across generations and steward the property, have legal standing, generational wealth, access resources, and overall just generational resiliency. In fact, the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation, which focuses on health, they draw a connection with housing stability and health. And I love that they see that so clearly, because that is generational too. Families' ability to have housing across generations is generational resiliency. But then on the community, government, and markets level, again, it's affordable housing. We often think of affordable housing in the context of new buildings, but to the extent that families maintain housing across generations, that's affordable housing. There's also natural resource protection, infrastructure stability. And what I mean by that, I'll just use as an example. In Montana, there was an heirs property partition case in which there was a little over 100 acres and 13 heirs, and one of the owners pursued a partition action, and the court ordered that the property be divided into multiple lots. And the local government panicked because they don't have the infrastructure to support those additional lots without comprehensive planning. So infrastructure sustainability is another incentive to address legal issues. Market supply, as I mentioned, and then overall resiliency at scale. On the individual basis, in terms of solutions, it's the way that we or what we preach in this space is that families look at their real estate with the same lens as a business, meaning that you have a single entity owner, and that entity is what's used to manage the ownership succession, management succession, decision making, etc., across generations. Of course, because many of these families have multiple owners and they don't have clear title, starting point for getting the single entity ownership is the family tree, because that's what we use for the legal analysis. So it's important that families have comprehensive family trees that include the original owner or owners and descend all the way down to the most recent family members, and includes information about dates of death, marriages, adoptions, etc. Then take the family tree to an attorney to do a title search and confirm who the current owners are. Those owners then hopefully can make decisions about consolidating ownership interest into a single entity owner, and then facilitate any buyouts and transfers to that entity. So folks, a lot of times when folks are reading literature about heirs property, they'll talk about wills. Wills are important, but I believe that families need succession planning, which is much more comprehensive because it's looking at not just the ownership succession, but also the management and the stewardship, et cetera. And only when we approach it with succession planning can we truly avoid heirs property. Solutions on the policy level have been pretty tremendous. We've seen FEMA expand their proof of ownership eligibility criteria. So up until 2021, most heirs property owners couldn't qualify for FEMA relief. Now they have expanded the eligibility criteria. It's still going to be very difficult, but we're hopeful that we'll see more families with heirs property actually get assistance when natural disaster hits, because we know there's going to be more and more of those. Farm Bill 2018 included expanded criteria to obtain a farm and tract number, which if you are familiar with the ag space, having a farm and tract number is so important in order to be able to work with USDA and get resources for cost share and technical assistance, et cetera. But they also established a loan program that would allow CDFIs to loan money to heirs property owners to resolve legal issues, do buyouts, et cetera. That really hasn't taken flight. And so for those of you on the call who may be expert in Farm Bill, there could be an opportunity for you to play a role in enhancing the provisions around the loan program for heirs property. And then we have the model legislation, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which when there's a partition action involving heirs property, this particular legislation overlays the existing legislation for partition action. And so in states that have adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, there's requirements such as the fair market value appraisal and the first right of buying out the interest of the petitioning owner's share. And then the sale has to be done on the market, open market, not at auction. And that's been pretty tremendous. It's my understanding that the model legislation is one of the most adopted model legislations in our history. It's in I think it's in about 23 jurisdictions that are all very diverse, from New York to California, Montana to Florida. A lot of it has been driven because of the environmental and conservation needs in those areas, but also just private personal property, private real estate ownership rights. So it's been wonderful to see how coalitions in different states are involving green organizations, social justice organizations, et cetera, because the folks understand that this issue with heirs property owner intersects with other issues like climate, et cetera. So now to the last year, since I gave the hot topics last year, we've seen significant changes over the last year. We have, there's been an expansion in the types and volume of support. A lot of philanthropic dollars have been driven to the heirs property space, which is tremendous. And then there's been a lot of interest from just various organizations. Fran Miller, who is a colleague here at CAFS, And I have had numerous conversations with folks from organizations like ALTA, which is the title insurance member organization, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, multiple foundations, forestry space, et cetera. We also have seen that attorneys are taking a more strategic legal approach to addressing this issue. Again, it's been very difficult for families to get access to comprehensive, trustworthy legal services, but we're now seeing more and more attorneys working on this, working on heirs property issues and being really thoughtful about how they approach it. Significant policy changes. I just mentioned 3 types of policies that have been developed for heirs property. And on the state level, I would say that there's been pretty innovative policy changes in states like New York. For example, they just passed a law where if a third party, and I'm probably going to state this a little wrong, but if a third party buys an interest of heirs property, the owners can buy them out at the same price that they paid when they bought it from the heir. And what this means is the significance is that what third parties will often do is that they'll buy a share for a low amount, but then because the partition action requires a fair market value, they'll then want fair market value for the share they bought. New York has this phenomenal law, and I hope that it stays in place. And I hope that it influences other states to consider policy changes that can alleviate this. Another example of significant policy changes is around property taxes and how people receive notice, especially when there's multiple owners. And then we've seen increased landowner engagement in resolution and planning. I think more and more people are attending educational events to learn about heirs property and learn about how they can manage it and address these issues. So it's been wonderful to see family heirs property owners taking action. And then there's, of course, been increased media and attention. Just in this past year, we've seen 3 documentaries, one called Gaining Ground that was commissioned and produced by John Deere, which portrays a few families, including a family that owns heirs property. We also saw, we'll soon see a film on sustainable forestry, but focused on Black families who have had heirs property in North Carolina. And then there's Silver Dollar Road, which is an Amazon film that featured a family that has heirs property that has had an incredibly tough journey with their family lands in the coastal area of North Carolina. But also lots of articles, both scholarly and for lay audiences. So heirs property is what some of us say is trending, which is great because I think it means that there's a significant shift in how we are viewing the issue and its relevance, but also in how we take action with heirs property. So thinking about innovation, I want to share about my own company and then turn to the heirs property practitioner network. My company is HeirShares. I had a law practice working on heirs property and found that I was very limited in the impact that I could have because I'm a solo practitioner. I was working with a lot of families that didn't have adequate resources to support the legal services. And so I decided to explore what role technology can play. And so HeirShares is a tech company. I'm a techpreneur and not very techy, but feels kind of good. And we've created a few products. So we do consulting and workshops. For example, we trained the North Carolina legal aid attorneys working on heirs property how to do title searches. And then we've consulted 2 corporations that want to support heirs property with their dollars. We also have a learning platform called deathanddirt.com. And if you go to deathanddirt.com, we have several courses that are really comprehensive, but they're also fun. I like to brag about that platform because I think my sister did a wonderful job designing it, but it's set up in ways where you plant, nourish, and grow your knowledge about heirs property, and it's for landowners as well as professionals. And then we have a help center that's AI assisted. The idea was to understand what people are searching for when it comes to heirs property and the internet. And we've been able to develop and curate articles that people are looking for through our help center. And then finally, we have a tree builder. So if you don't know about clearing title, I apologize. But as I mentioned before, the process of clearing title is quite difficult. And I would spend on average 2 to 5 years clearing title on heirs property matters. And my clients would spend on average $5,000 to $8,000 to clear title, which meant that a lot of them didn't have resources to then move into the succession planning phase of our engagement. And I had this belief that technology could play a role in making the process more easy, but also more affordable. And so our Tree Builder app is our flagship app. That's meant to solve that problem. We did a deep customer discovery to understand what the challenges were for attorneys, but also for heirs property owners, and we learned a lot. We learned that a lot of people are not hopeful that they can resolve their issues and are really desperate to find something that helps them in a meaningful way. But also a lot of attorneys that are working in this space are overwhelmed with the demand of clients that need the services, but also with the complexity. And so we talked to a variety of folks, again, attorneys, but in the landowner realm, we looked at baby boomers, Gen X, and millennial, or interviewed baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And then we, of course, interviewed government agencies and nonprofit leaders to understand, what were these pain points? What was the biggest if you will? And then what was the biggest aha for these folks? So that led us to create this tool. We did what we call rapid experimentation. But essentially, my co-founder, Otis, who is a mathematician, was able to take the information from the 50-state legal survey I did on inheritance and create an algorithm that makes predictive analysis of ownership changes based on family tree data. So it is inclusive of any folks that had wills and any folks that may have deeded the property while they're alive. But simply put, it's taking what I did in my head and turned it into math. And the output is a report that highlights every event that caused a change in ownership in the heirs property. We will begin testing the app this summer. This residency at the law school is kind of my intermission before I launch into my full-time role at HeirShares, but that will be my first big project, is testing this app. It's currently programmed for North Carolina. That was the slide that I was supposed to use for that. And then the other big thing that's happened in the last year that has been incredibly special, not just for me and for Fran Miller, is the Heirs Property Practitioner Network. Many of you who know Fran know that Fran has been engaging with a lot of different organizations through the Center for Ag and Food Systems. And what that has led to is monthly Zoom meetings at the end of 2022, where we were just getting together and just talking, just sharing, our experiences, counseling one another from an emotional perspective, but also from a legal perspective, educating one another, et cetera. And then that blossomed into an incredible movement in which we even had our first in-person gathering in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at Wake Forest University, where approximately 50 attorneys came together for a few days to, again, learn, encourage, and support. And I can't say enough about the Center for Ag and Food Systems and their support in doing this, because this is pretty revolutionary. Since the October in-person event, we've grown to 100 plus attorneys. So really in the last 2 years, we've grown, or year and a half, we've gone from a handful of attorneys to 100 plus attorneys who are working in 21 plus states. We have our monthly meetings on Zoom. We also have a listserv. And then more recently, we've begun to hone in on what our more short-term objectives are, which I think any of you who have some expertise that I'll talk about in a minute could leverage to support the Heirs Property Practitioner Network. The objectives that we are currently focused on right now are developing a supporting infrastructure for HAPN, the Heirs Property Practitioner Network. And we brought in a facilitator to really help us explore whether we should create yet another 501c3 or function more loosely and have the support of other existing organizations in fiscal sponsorship and administration, et cetera. Another objective is to enhance the referral methodology and practices of making referrals. As I've highlighted, there's an incredible amount of heirs property in the US. There's an incredible demand for legal services for resolving heirs property issues. And the standard, I would say, in terms of connecting those potential clients with the few attorneys that work on this issue is usually word of mouth and through internet searches. But what ultimately happens is that the attorneys who are fielding these inquiries are getting taxed from the, and overwhelmed with just even finding out if it's a matter that they can take on. And so we really want to be thoughtful about how we can create a referral system that's meaningful for the landowners and actually connects them with suitable legal counsel and supports the attorneys who are working on these issues and ensures that they're not overwhelmed with administrative tasks and just managing referrals. Another objective is to advance solutions to the capital question. So something I didn't talk about in detail today is the fact that legal services cost, well, we know that. But the other capital need the heirs property owners have is around performing buyout, getting maintenance on the property and upgrading the property so that it is sustainable across generations. And traditional loan products aren't enough. And of course, there's not always enough philanthropic dollars to support that. And so we, as a network, we continually are looking to advance solutions to this capital question. What are some creative ways to bring more capital into this space so that people do have access to legal services, access to capital to do buyouts and consolidate ownership interests for their succession plan, access to capital that allows them to maintain and improve the property in a way that it's the most resilient it can be. And then we've also determined that we are going to have a biannual in-person gathering because what we learned by gathering in person is that 100 seems large, but it actually is still small. Ensure that we have a space where we can be together and learn from one another, support one another, and grow as a movement. And so I would love, I don't know how we can facilitate this, but I would love to answer questions that folks have. But I would also like to invite a brainstorm from the audience about the different areas of impact through HAPN and beyond. So for example, on capital for landowners, if anyone has experience with innovative ways of bringing capital for social justice type issues. HAPN, as I mentioned, as an organization, we're not a legal entity, but we're exploring models for how we operate as a network of attorneys doing this work. Another area of innovation that needs expertise is around government relations and corporate relations. Policy is very important, but also government relations and corporate relations are important too, because that's how we get policy change. And I would say that in the legal ecosystem, but also the broader heirs property ecosystem, there's not a lot of expertise and experience with government relations. So that's a big need in the area. Of course, innovative policy solutions, forgive me for the typo. Right now, we've focused on, like I said, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, the Farm Bill, and FEMA. But there's probably other areas, particularly in the green or conservation space, in which we can create legislation that unlocks capital, that unlocks other resources, and enables folks to keep their property. I think another important thing is to understand how we can better help folks understand that resolution of heirs property issues is part of climate action, meaning that, if we look back at that map in North Carolina, where we saw a lot of the red in the eastern part of the state, what also happens in that area of North Carolina is a lot of confined animal feeding operations. And in North Carolina, we don't regulate poultry, so we don't even know like how many CAFOs there are with poultry, but there's a ton of CAFOs in North Carolina in that area. There's also coal ash sites and other waste in those areas. And then there's also a lot of coastal flooding. So the numerosity of heirs property and unstable real estate ownership in North Carolina is exactly overlaid where there's the most climate risk in that state. And I suspect the same is true in other geographies. Technology, we believe, plays a role, and that's why I started HeirShares. But also a look at the model for a broader ecosystem. There's some curiosity about what it would look like for there to be a national alliance, a national heirs property alliance that covers both the legal aspect, but the other professional services and policy action that's happening. We talked about capital for the landowners, but also capital needed for the legal ecosystem, and then enhancing the practice of working in heirs property. So we think of real estate, trust and estate, IP, et cetera, as practice areas. Well, now we have a practice area of heirs property, which combines multiple practice areas. And so there's a great need for enhancing the practice with training, standards, and tools. So I'm going to pause. I know it's 12:43. And I'm wondering if there's any questions, Jenny, or whether there's ideas that folks have in the audience around some of these innovations that I pointed out.
Perfect. Thank you. So yes, for our audience, we do have a few minutes for you to ask some questions or to offer some brainstorming ideas, as Mavis was suggesting. And you can enter your questions in the chat or the comment space on YouTube, and we'll get through as many as we can. And I do have a couple questions teed up already. So one was, could you provide an example of a single entity owner, and how would that carry through between generations?
Yeah, great question. So most often folks are using either a trust, which is a relationship between three parties, settlor, trustee, and the beneficiaries. So that's one approach that's very common. And then another approach is a limited liability company. There are multiple factors to consider in any type of entity. The state laws regarding those entities is of course important, but then also the legal sophistication of the clients or the family and their ability to understand. For example, I had a family that from a technical perspective, it made more sense to use a trust, but from a legal sophistication perspective, it was just very difficult for them to understand how a trust works. And so we don't want you to transfer it to a trustee and then things just like not work. So we ultimately went with the LLC. So the legal sophistication of the family is a factor, the cost of management, et cetera. But certainly there are other entities. I would say Montana, as an example, has some really great laws around entities, and they even have like family-specific corporations that could be used for heirs property management. But yeah, it's an important consideration, the type of entity. But the idea is that you do away with, for example, unanimous voting. The idea is that you can have more flexibility in who's benefiting, when they're benefiting, and how they're benefiting from the property. You can have more control over what's happening in successive generations of family members, so that it doesn't, lay fallow, et cetera. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And a comment from online. Vermont funds legal representation to underserved groups through a legal bonus program. and funds this through the interest on our client trust accounts. That's a
Mm.
program through the Vermont Bar Association.
Great point. I love seeing that North Carolina Legal Aid took on or is working on heirs property. They initially were doing it for disaster relief, but now they're expanding that. And we've also seen a lot of or heard from quite a few large law firms that are interested in doing pro bono work, which is good. And it's approaching that is very nuanced. And so I love to think about, I love your suggestion about the dollars that are coming through the state bars that could be used to support those systems.
Okay, another question. Someone says they're glad that this subject is more in the news, but is there any other outreach communication directly to the property owners to be proactive and educate them better and give them solutions before an issue arises?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly we hope to do that with Death and Dirt, but I think also, I don't think, and this is my personal opinion, I don't think that there's anyone in the heirs property space that has really figured out how to leverage social media and social networking as a way of educating people. For example, I think that, an organization that's working with landowners on multiple things, including heirs property or, securing ownership, but perhaps also agriculture and forestry, what would it look like to have an app or to somehow use SMS to send just, information that helps them understand better, like little info points. So I do think that there's a great opportunity to leverage social networking and social media, as well as other tools that, are just in people's hands easily, just that they could learn. And then in terms of other media, I don't know, like I do think that another area of exploration could be through entertainment. Like I love that there's documentaries that are about the issue. There have been, I've started collecting names of shows that talk about heirs property. They don't name it as heirs property, but there are actually quite a few shows that will have heirs property issues. And I think that's wonderful. And I would love to see it done more intentionally. The only example I know that where it was done intentionally was with Queen Sugar, which was this show on Oprah's network. And I actually got to consult them on how they talk about heirs property. But I definitely think there could be some like good fictional fact-based entertainment media that helps people really connect to the issue. So anyone in Hollywood on this call, holler at me.
That's a great idea. It's certainly been helpful with climate change, I would say.
Yeah.
So I'm curious for you talk about a lot of attorneys working on the heirs property issue, and it sounds like there's plenty of work to be done. Can you speak a little bit about like whether this is a career path for students who really want to work on agriculture issues, and what does that look like? Are we talking about the opportunity for paid work, or is this more bono or foundation funded?
Oh, I love that question. And one, because it reminds me that I didn't point out the fact that there are now law school clinics focusing on heirs property. So Wake Forest, for example, Howard University, there's a school in Texas, St. Mary's, I'm blanking on the full name. But I love the fact that we're now seeing more law schools with clinics because, yes, the students can get that experience in law school and they can learn about how they can be I think when you're doing heirs property work, you're a lawyer, but you're really a real estate professional. Like you have to know about a lot of different things, including like ag and how families with ag land are navigating the USDA and other spaces. And so I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity. There's also a lot of need for attorneys who are committed to working with families who are in the ag space and be based in rural areas. What we see is that a lot of families do not have access to trustworthy attorneys that have their best interest at heart and who are not going to try to drive them into, for example, physically dividing the property. A lot of times when we see families voluntarily physically dividing the property, it's in rural spaces, and it's because the attorneys have said, oh, this is the best thing to do, just divide up the farm. Well, we know that when you have smaller acreage as a farm, the productivity is also diminished. And so there's a great need for students. And I think also it's just, even though it's hard work, I think it's much more enjoyable because as their legal counsel, you become part of the family, and you could be part of the family for multiple generations. And so I think it's a great opportunity for students. And the attorneys that are working in the space that came from other areas have expressed that this has been some of the most meaningful work that they've done, not just because of the social impact, but because of the fact that you're doing law for good. Like, you're not just like trying to make the billable hour or whatever. So yeah, I think a lot of opportunity for students.
And do you think those opportunities are like working at law firms, or like what's the framework in which people who want to do that work need to find themselves? Do they need to go to an NGO?
Yeah, that's a great question, because right now, what we see is that a lot of folks who are coming out of law school and working in this space are going directly to an NGO, like nonprofit law firms, whether it's legal aid or Center for Heirs Property Preservation, what have you, which I think gives them a lot of training experience. But I will say a current reality is that when, coming out of law school, especially with debt, and then going to a nonprofit job is often not tenable for people who don't have their own family wealth, so to speak. And while there are a lot of private practice law firms doing this work, most often they're solo and small firms, and so their capacity to bring in an inexperienced attorney is limited. So I would say that's actually a hurdle that we have to overcome in the next few years. And could larger firms with more resources actually create practices supportive of heirs property? There certainly are larger firms that have resources that do that, but they're working with the heirs property owners who are land rich and cash rich. So how do we find that kind of perfect space where the law firms have the resources and the skills and can bring in new attorneys that are also thriving financially and doing this important work? That's still something that we have to work on. Thank you for asking that question.
All right, we should wrap up there. Thank you so much, Mavis, for your presentation. It's very interesting and useful. And thank you, everybody who joined us today. Our next talk will be on Tuesday next week at noon, same place. And we hope you can join us then. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.